You know, usually when we talk about like a traffic light turning red, there's this expectation of just automatic compliance.
Oh, yeah. Like physics?
Right, like
Yeah.
physics. The light turns red, your foot hits the brake, and the system just works.
It's a totally ingrained habit, certainly. I mean, it feels binary. The visual stimulus triggers the physical response.
Mhm.
You rarely sit there at the intersection pondering the philosophical weight of the red light.
Right, because it's clean
Yeah.
and comforting. We like our rules to be visible, to be universally understood, and, to just be followed without much debate.
Yeah, exactly.
But so what happens when you strip away the metal pole and the glowing bulbs, when you step into the world of like political power or government mandates and systemic coercion? Suddenly that red light is entirely up for debate.
It gets messy.
Very messy. We're looking at a landscape of rules and laws that is chaotic, to put it mildly. So today we're asking for you, the listener, who actually has the moral right to build the political traffic light, point to it and tell you that you absolutely must stop your life or pay your taxes or close your business.
Right.
We are asking a really fundamental question here. How do we actually know if the people in charge have the right to tell us what to do? Because navigating the political world today, I mean, it feels much less like an abstract intellectual exercise and much more like a literal survival guide.
I think that's the exact tension driving the source material we're pulling apart today.
Mm.
We are unpacking a remarkably dense and really profound book called The Grounds of Political Legitimacy. It's by Oxford University professor Fabienne Peter, published in 2023.
Yeah.
And, she's not interested in the surface-level partisan bickering that we see on the news every night. She is drilling down into the absolute bedrock of government authority.
And our mission for you on this deep dive is to explore what philosophers call the meta-normative question. Basically, we are asking what actually grounds the permission to make binding political decisions.
Right.
Let me give you an analogy to kind of separate this from normal political debate. Imagine someone builds a house on a plot of land. A normal, normative debate is arguing over whether the house is painted a nice color or if the roof leaks or if the rent is fair.
Sure.
That's arguing about whether a government decision is good or just. But a meta-normative debate isn't about the house at all. It's asking to see the deed to the land.
That's a great way to put it.
It's asking what gave you the underlying authority to pour concrete here in the first place. We are looking at what gives a government decision the ultimate, undeniable authority to bind you, the citizen, to actually obey it.
That's a highly effective way to frame it, yeah.
Yeah.
The deed to the land.
Yeah.
So Fabienne Peter looks at the history of political philosophy and essentially categorizes the arguments for that deed into three main contenders.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first is the political will, which argues that legitimacy stems directly from the people themselves.
Makes sense.
The second is normative facts, which suggests that legitimacy comes from a decision simply being objectively morally right, regardless of what the people think.
Right, okay.
And the third is cognitive political authority, which argues that legitimacy is grounded in expertise. Basically, that those who know the most have the right to decide.
Okay, well, let me stop you there, though. Because my immediate reaction, and I would bet the reaction of almost anyone listening who was raised in a modern Western society, is to point aggressively to that first contender.
A political will.
Exactly, the political will,
Yeah.
democracy. I mean, why isn't the conversation just over right there? If the people vote for a policy where they vote for the leader who makes the policy, well, it has the deed to the land. It is legitimate.
It seems intuitive, because that concept is basically the foundational mythology of our political reality, right?
Yeah.
But Peter begins by untangling a massive conceptual knot that trips, well, most of us up. We have to clearly separate political legitimacy from legality, and we have to separate it from justice.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's pull those apart. Legality seems the easiest to confuse with legitimacy, I think.
Yeah, take Peter's example of the 2020 U.S. election. If we analyze it strictly through the lens of legality, the election was sound.
Right.
The bureaucratic mechanisms functioned, the votes were tabulated according to the statutory requirements of each state, and the courts upheld a procedural execution. It conformed to the written law.
Okay.
But legality is merely conformity to the existing paperwork. Legitimacy is far heavier. Peter defines legitimacy as a two-pronged concept. It requires the moral permission to make a decision on behalf of a group, and this is key, it requires the bindingness of that decision on the citizens.
So legality is just the state following its own rule book. Like a totalitarian dictator can legally execute political dissidents if the dictator wrote the constitution that allows it.
Exactly.
But no reasonable person would call that a politically legitimate action. The moral permission is completely absent.
Precisely. And it's equally important to separate legitimacy from justice.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, a government might make a decision that is deeply unjust,
Yeah.
say a flawed tax policy that accidentally widens wealth inequality.
Right.
But if that government had the moral permission to make tax policy and the citizens are morally bound to follow it while working to, repeal it or whatever, the decision was still legitimate, even if it was unjust.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes the stakes incredibly clear.
Yeah.
So let's look at this first major contender then, the idea that the political will provides this moral permission.
Right, so Peter traces this will-based or voluntarist conception of legitimacy through centuries of thought. You see the seeds of it in Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, it blossoms in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it absolutely dominates modern democratic theory.
Okay.
The entire architecture of this worldview rests on a single, vital assumption, which is the equal political authoritativeness of all citizens.
The equal political authoritativeness. So like strip away wealth, strip away education, social status. At a fundamental human level, my opinion on how our shared society should be structured holds the exact same gravitational pull as your opinion.
Exactly.
Neither of us has a divine or natural right to rule the other. We are both like self-originating sources of valid claims.
Yes, and because of that profound equality, the only conceivable way a decision can be legitimate, the only way it can forcefully bind us both, is if it somehow responds to our collective will.
Right.
But how we define and measure that collective will has kind of splintered into several different philosophical flavors over the centuries.
Yeah, and the first flavor she details is unanimity. And I want to dig into this because it sounds great on paper, but feels, honestly, impossible in practice. This is the classic Hobbes and Rousseau approach, right?
It is. Hobbes is really fascinating here because his starting point is so incredibly bleak. In his theoretical state of nature, life is famously solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, the classic quote.
Right. We are all terrified of each other. So out of sheer self-preservation, we unanimously agree to surrender our individual power to a sovereign, the Leviathan. The legitimacy of that terrifying absolute ruler comes entirely from the fact that we all willed it into existence to basically save us from each other.
It sounds a bit like a mob protection racket. Like, we all unanimously agree to let the boss extort us so the rival gangs don't kill us.
That's one way to look at it.
But then you have Rousseau, who takes unanimity in a slightly different direction with the general will. And Rousseau is tricky because the general will isn't just a literal unanimous show of hands in the town square.
No, it's much more abstract. For Rousseau, the general will is the collective interest of the citizenry, aimed at the common good. It's what the people would unanimously choose if they were thinking purely as citizens prioritizing the state, rather than as, private individuals prioritizing their own wallets.
Which opens up a massive loophole, doesn't it? Like, who gets to decide what the general will actually is?
That is the perennial question with Rousseau, yes.
But putting that aside, Peter moves from unanimity to the second flavor, the public reason conception. This brings in Immanuel Kant and later the 20th century philosopher John Rawls.
Right, and public reason is a massive shift. It moves away from the requirement that every single person must literally agree to a policy. Instead, it asks, are the reasons behind a political decision acceptable to all reasonable citizens?
Okay, so it's less about the vote and more about the logic.
Exactly. It's an exercise in shared justification. If a government passes a law mandating public education, the legitimacy doesn't come from a unanimous vote. It comes from the fact that any reasonable citizen engaging in public discourse could understand and accept the underlying rationale that an educated populace benefits the whole society.
It's like a hypothetical test. You don't have to love the law, but you have to be able to logically recognize the civic reasoning behind it.
Yes.
And then Peter identifies the third flavor of the will-based conception, which is probably the most familiar to us, participation.
This is procedural democracy.
Yeah?
The idea here is that legitimacy is entirely grounded in giving everyone an equal say in the process. The procedure itself, the campaigns, the debates, the secret ballot, is what alchemizes individual opinions into a legitimate, binding outcome.
And crucially, under the participation model, you are bound by the outcome even if you voted against it.
Right, because the procedure was fair.
You lost the vote, but because your voice was equally counted, the government still has the moral permission to coerce you. But And here's where I have to step in and push back aggressively against this entire political will framework.
Okay, lay it on me.
Because if legitimacy is solely defined by what the people want or what the voting procedure spits out, we have a catastrophic blind spot. What happens when the people collectively will something that is demonstrably physically disastrous?
You've identified the exact philosophical vulnerability that Peter uses to dismantle the pure will-based conception.
Yeah, and the book uses some incredibly stark examples, and they make the abstract very grounded. She points to the Flint, Michigan water crisis and the broader, terrifying reality of global inaction on climate change.
Yes.
Let's look at Flint. You had a democratically elected local government. The democratic machinery was humming along. The will of the people produced the leaders who made the decisions. And those leaders switched the water supply to save money, resulting in lead poisoning for a massive population, including thousands of children.
It's a haunting example because the procedure was technically intact, but the outcome was a horrific failure of basic safety.
Exactly. So if we cling to the idea that the political will is the ultimate ground of legitimacy, we are forced into a horrifying corner. We would have to say that the decision to poison the water supply of Flint was a legitimate political decision simply because it flowed from the authorized democratic procedure. That feels instinctively wrong.
And Peter gives that instinct a formal philosophical name, the arbitrariness objection.
The arbitrariness objection.
Her argument is that if we say legitimacy relies purely on the political will, without any tether to objective reality or facts, we risk supporting entirely arbitrary and actively harmful decisions. If the only standard for a valid political claim is that a citizen desires it, we have decoupled the steering wheel of the state from the road.
Let me test this with another scenario. Let's say a town holds a perfectly fair, universally accessible vote to decide whether gravity exists. And 90% of the town votes that gravity is a hoax. Based purely on the equal political authoritativeness of the citizens, the will of the people has spoken. The town council then mandates that everyone should jump off their roofs to commute to work.
Well, under a pure will-based conception, that mandate is structurally legitimate,
Which is insane.
which reveals the absurdity of relying solely on the will. Peter explores this by looking at how empirical facts are treated in modern political discourse. She uses highly polarizing recent examples to test this theory. She points to the 2020 election fraud claims in the United States and the campaign claims surrounding the actual financial costs of Brexit in the UK.
Right. And looking at those analytically, completely divorced from the partisan emotion, you see the arbitrariness perfectly.
Yeah.
When a large segment of a population asserts that an election was rigged, despite the courts and the investigative bodies showing a complete lack of empirical evidence.
Or when voters will have a massive geopolitical shift like Brexit based on demonstrably inaccurate claims about how much money would be freed up for the National Health Service.
Exactly. The pure will-based conception just freezes.
It freezes because it lacks a mechanism to filter out falsehoods. If we are all truly equally politically authoritative and the only thing that matters is our will, then my fervent belief in a complete fabrication is theoretically just as politically valid as your belief in a thoroughly proven scientific fact.
Which is terrifying. It means pure democracy, unchecked by reality, isn't some noble pursuit of freedom. It's a hostage situation governed by whatever delusion captures the majority.
It's a very real danger.
So if the political will is fundamentally flawed because it allows for arbitrary, fact-ignoring decisions, the logical pivot is obvious. Why don't we just base legitimacy on making the objectively correct decision? Which brings us to the second contender Peter explores, the trap of facts.
Yes, this is political factualism. It's a fact-based conception of legitimacy. And, there is a real elegance to it. It argues that a political decision is legitimate simply because it is the right thing to do, according to normative facts.
Let me try to build a hypothetical here to see if I understand how a factualist views the world.
Go for it.
Let's say a country has a tax code that was written 100 years ago, and through a series of loopholes, it has resulted in 90% of the population living in abject poverty while 1% hoards all the resources.
Okay.
It is demonstrably, mathematically crushing human flourishing. Reforming that tax system to distribute the burden fairly isn't just a preference, it's an objective moral necessity.
Right.
So under a factualist conception, if a leader bypasses the corrupt parliament and just mandates a fair tax code by executive decree, that decree is legitimate purely because reforming an unjust system is the right thing to do.
You've captured it perfectly. Peter refers to this as the no magic argument. The authority to make a binding decision doesn't magically appear from a ballot box or a social contract.
Yeah.
It has to come from the fact that the decision aligns with an objective, normative truth. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if the public supports the tax reform. It doesn't matter if they voted against it because they were manipulated by propaganda. The normative fact that the current system is actively unjust is what grants the moral permission to change it.
It's incredibly appealing, especially when you are frustrated by the gridlock of democracy. Just do the right thing. But it feels like a massive philosophical trap. Because who gets to define the objective moral truth?
And Peter dismantles factualism by identifying exactly that trap. She calls it the accessibility objection.
Accessibility objection,
And
meaning?
she argues that for a normative property or a fact to be useful in grounding political legitimacy, it must have a settling function in public deliberation. It has to be able to actually settle the debate and tell us what to do.
But what if the ultimate truth of a normative fact is completely inaccessible to the general public? Let's take my tax example. Maybe there is a mathematically perfect, universally just tax code out there in the metaphysical ether.
Sure.
But if understanding why it's perfect requires a postdoctoral understanding of macroeconomics, behavioral psychology, and global supply chains, how can it possibly settle a debate at a local town hall meeting?
It can't. If the truth is inaccessible to the minds of the people who are being coerced by it, it cannot legitimately bind them. We cannot be held morally accountable to a standard we lack the capacity to grasp. Factualism assumes that the truth is just sitting there waiting to be picked up and implemented. But in reality, truth is often obscured, infinitely complex, and deeply contested.
Okay, so pure facts are too inaccessible, and pure political will is too arbitrary. We're running out of options here.
We are.
But there's a pivot here. If the truth exists, but it's too complex for the average citizen, the natural conclusion is to hand the keys to the people who can understand it. We move to belief-based conceptions.
This is the third contender, cognitive political authority. If legitimacy isn't in the raw will, and it isn't in the inaccessible facts, perhaps it is grounded in an epistemic advantage. In short, expertise.
Epistocracy, the rule of the knowers. The core argument is, if you have spent your entire life studying public health, you have a superior grasp of the data, the virology, the models. Therefore, you have the cognitive authority to make the binding public health decisions, and my uneducated opinion should carry absolutely zero weight.
It's a very compelling argument, especially during crises, but it faces a devastating counter-argument. It's known as the standing objection, and the philosopher Stephen Darwall frames it brilliantly as the expert boss fallacy.
The expert boss fallacy. I think I know where this is going. If I take my car to a master mechanic, she knows infinitely more about my transmission than I do. She has absolute epistemic authority regarding the state of my vehicle. She tells me the brakes are going to fail.
Right.
But if she then breaks into my garage in the middle of the night and replaces the brakes against my will and then hands me a bill, she has committed a crime. Knowing the truth about my brakes does not make her the boss of my property.
Exactly. Darwall argues that epistemic authority, knowing the truth about something, only gives you the standing to offer advice or issue a warning. It does not magically transmute into practical political authority to coerce someone else into action. A cardiologist knows the exact diet that will save your life, but that knowledge does not give them the political legitimacy to forcefully empty your refrigerator and mandate your caloric intake.
But I don't think Fabian Peter entirely accepts the expert boss fallacy, does she? Because she introduced an analogy here that completely rewired how I think about expertise. I want to build this out because it's the fulcrum of her entire book, the Japanese knotweed analogy.
It is brilliant. Let's walk through the exact mechanics of it because the nuances really matter here.
Okay, picture this. You are buying a house. It's your absolute dream home, beautiful wraparound porch, perfect neighborhood. It's the culmination of years of saving. But part of the process is hiring a highly qualified, certified property surveyor.
Right.
The surveyor inspects the grounds and comes back to you with a grim report. Listen, they say, this property is severely infested with Japanese knotweed. Now, Japanese knotweed is an incredibly invasive, relentless plant whose root systems literally crack concrete and destroy the structural foundations of buildings.
So the expert has delivered the empirical facts based on their specific cognitive authority.
Right. Now, you hear this, but the wraparound porch is so beautiful. You convince yourself the surveyor's overreacting. You ignore the expert. You buy the house anyway. 2 years later, the foundation splits, the walls crack, the house is condemned, and you are financially ruined. Now, who do you blame?
You can only blame yourself.
Exactly. You hold yourself completely accountable for your own foolishness. But let's dig into why. The surveyor wasn't your boss. Darwell is right about that. The surveyor had no legal authority to rip the pen out of your hand and stop you from signing the mortgage.
No, they didn't.
But their clear, undeniable expertise created a condition in reality where you should have known better. The surveyor's knowledge created a moral boundary. By ignoring it, you violated what Peter calls epistemic accountability for action.
That is the pivotal phrase, epistemic accountability. The expert advice didn't physically stop you, but it morally bound your actions. And Peter takes this concept of epistemic accountability from the private sphere of buying a house and applies it directly to the coercive sphere of politics.
And to do that, she elevates the stakes. She uses the hypothetical of the town bridge. Let's say a town council is planning to build a massive new suspension bridge over a gorge. They hire a town engineer, a person with an absolutely faultless, globally recognized track record in structural mechanics.
Okay.
The engineer reviews the blueprints and states definitively, if you build this bridge using these materials under these load conditions, the structural integrity will fail, the bridge will collapse, and hundreds of people will die.
Now, we apply the political will framework to this scenario. Suppose the town council ignores the engineer. Suppose they hold a massive town hall, present the engineer's findings, and then hold a democratic vote. And the town, perhaps because they really want the economic boost the bridge will bring, votes 100% unanimously to build the bridge anyway.
Under the pure will-based conception, that unanimous vote gives the council the absolute moral permission to build the bridge. It is perfectly legitimate.
But Peter argues that is absurd and morally bankrupt. A democratic vote cannot legitimately override that level of definitive life-or-death expertise. No town council, no matter how pure their democratic mandate, has the permission to make a binding decision to build a bridge that experts have empirically proven will kill people. The epistemic accountability of the decision-makers forces deference to the expert.
In this specific, narrow case, the expert actually does become the boss. Not because they have a crown on their head, but because ignoring them is an active choice to be illegitimate and invite catastrophe.
Exactly. The town council is in the same position as the homebuyer ignoring the knotweed. They are epistemically accountable for the disaster.
It is a phenomenal argument, but I am going to push back on it heavily because as satisfying as the bridge example is, it feels like a parlor trick. Politics is almost never a binary physics problem about tensile strength.
I think you're hitting on the core vulnerability there. And Peter is fully aware of that limitation, which is why she introduces the concept of epistemic underdetermination.
Epistemic underdetermination. It sounds like a diagnosis for a foggy brain, but it essentially means the expert truth is incomplete, heavily contested, or just too murky to act upon definitively.
Right. Peter outlines what she calls the epistemic circumstances of politics.
Ooh.
In the chaotic reality of governing a state, cognitive authority usually fails to provide a clear answer for three specific reasons. First, the body of evidence is deeply fragmented.
Okay.
Second, the political competence of the actors is insufficient to process all the variables. Or third, the true expert simply cannot be reliably identified amidst a sea of conflicting credentials.
Let's ground this in recent history, because the early days of the COVID-19 lockdowns are the absolute perfect illustration of epistemic underdetermination. In March 2020, leaders were frantically searching for the falling bridge expert to tell them what to do. But there wasn't one.
No, because the problem wasn't a single discipline. You had brilliant epidemiologists looking at the viral spread and concluding that a total immediate lockdown was the only way to prevent mass casualties.
But you also had brilliant economists looking at a total lockdown and concluding that it would sever global supply chains, destroy millions of livelihoods, and cause catastrophic levels of poverty and starvation. And you had developmental sociologists warning about the permanent psychological damage of isolating a generation of children.
The evidence was entirely fragmented across disciplines that rarely speak the same language. And the politicians, the decision-makers, lacked the infinite cognitive competence required to weigh the precise value of a 2% reduction in viral transmission against a 15% spike in childhood depression and a 5% drop in GDP.
It required weighing fundamentally incommensurable values against each other. Public health versus economic survival versus civil liberties. There was no single expert standing in the room who had the cognitive authority to magically solve that multivariable equation. The right decision was completely epistemically underdetermined.
And this highlights a fundamental limitation of the human mind. We simply do not possess the processing power to hold the localized economic realities of millions of people in one hand and the mutating epidemiological data of a novel virus in the other and calculate the exact, objectively correct moral path.
Which leaves us staring at a massive, seemingly unsolvable dilemma. We spent the first part of this deep dive proving that the political will democracy can be dangerously arbitrary and ignore reality, leading to Flint water crises.
Right.
Then we proved that pure facts are too complex to settle debates. And now we've just proven that relying on cognitive authority experts is often impossible because reality is too complex and the evidence is fragmented. How on earth do we build a functional, legitimate government out of this wreckage?
This is where we arrive at Fabienne Peter's masterstroke, the epistemic accountability conception. This is her ultimate hybrid solution to the grounds of political legitimacy.
A hybrid model. It intuitively makes sense. If neither pure will nor pure expertise works on its own, you have to fuse them together.
But she doesn't just toss them into a blender and hope for the best. She proposes a highly specific architectural structure. It is a priority account. Specifically, she argues that cognitive political authority has lexicographic priority over the political will.
Lexicographic priority. Let's unpack the mechanics of that. A lexicon is a dictionary. In a dictionary, A strictly comes before B. Apple will always be listed before banana. The order is absolute.
Exactly. Applied to politics, it means that if clear, decisive epistemic authority does exist, like our town engineer definitively proving the bridge will collapse, that expertise absolutely, unquestioningly trumps the political will.
Well,
You cannot democratically vote to ignore gravity. Epistemic constraints place a hard, impenetrable ceiling on our political choices. The will of the people is entirely invalid. It loses all its moral permission if it demands something demonstrably false or imminently physically disastrous.
that satisfies my desire for a reality-based government. If the scientists tell us an asteroid is going to hit Paris, we don't hold a referendum on whether asteroids are real. We build a deflection system.
Yes.
But as we just spent 10 minutes establishing with the COVID-19 example, clear, decisive expertise is incredibly rare in the messy reality of politics. The bridge almost never falls neatly. So what happens the other 99% of the time when we are drowning in epistemic underdetermination?
This is where the brilliance of our hybrid model truly shows itself. Peter introduces the conditional normativity of the political will. When the experts do not have a clear, unified, universally accepted answer, which is the vast majority of political life, the primary ground of legitimacy, which is expertise, runs out. It exhausts its utility. And only when that happens does the secondary ground kick in, the political will.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the magnitude of this shift. In this framework, democracy voting, public debate, majority rule is not the glorious absolute foundation of human freedom. It is only normative conditionally.
That's right.
Democracy is the fallback mechanism. It is the emergency generator that kicks on when the primary power source of objective expertise fails us.
That is exactly right. Because we cannot figure out the absolute best, most factually correct decision.
Yeah.
We have to fall back on mutual accountability. We have to look at each other, acknowledge our shared ignorance, treat each other as political equals, and figure it out together. We use the democratic process to adjudicate between a plurality of valid but conflicting claims about how to run society.
I have to admit, looking at the entire geopolitical landscape through this specific lens, well, it is incredibly elegant. It perfectly respects the listener's deep desire, our shared desire for facts, sanity, and expertise. We desperately want a government that listens to scientists, economists, and engineers when lives are on the line and the data is clear.
Of course we do.
But it also deeply acknowledges the frustrating, messy reality that experts are human, they don't know everything, and their models frequently conflict. Thus, it preserves the absolute vital necessity of democracy. Democracy isn't the primary goal, it's the crucial safety net for when certainty fails us.
The deeply pragmatic, almost weary view of legitimacy. It strips away the romanticism of both pure epistocracy and pure democracy. But of course, building a philosophical model is one thing. Actually running a country with it is another, which raises a massive practical question. How does this hybrid theory actually play out in the daily grind of politicians arguing, media spinning, and citizens debating policies?
Right, because if legitimacy relies on this incredibly delicate, shifting balance between respecting expertise and deferring to the public will, we have to look very closely at the connective tissue between the two. We have to look at how we talk to each other. We have to examine political deliberation.
Fabienne Peter dedicates a significant portion of the book to this. and she favors what she calls a justificationist view of legitimacy, explicitly rejecting the older consent view.
Let's define the consent view first. This goes back to Locke, right? The idea that a government is only legitimate if the governed actively consent to it.
Yes, but in a modern, pluralistic nation of 300 million diverse people, universal consent is practically impossible. Every single law will infuriate someone. If legitimacy requires everyone to agree, then no modern state is legitimate.
So under the justificationist view, legitimacy isn't about everyone nodding in agreement. It's about whether a decision is supported by a process of well-ordered political deliberation. It's about the quality of the conversation and whether the reasons we use to justify a policy to each other actually hold water.
And this brings up a crucial, often misunderstood point about the role of dissent in a society. Under the consent view, dissent is just someone saying, "I opt out." But under the justificationist view, dissent plays an active, vital epistemic role. Peter uses the Black Lives Matter protests as a prime example of dissent acting as a delegitimizing force.
Oh, I see how that works. Because the protests weren't just a group of people saying, we don't like the police. They were actively offering defeating reasons against unjust policies. They were dragging massive amounts of empirical evidence data on systemic bias, arrest records, instances of police violence into the public sphere.
Right.
They were actively undermining the justification for the existing criminal justice system.
Precisely. They were participating in the deliberation by saying, the premises upon which your policies are built are factually flawed, and here is the proof. When that kind of valid evidence is introduced, the deliberation must adapt to it, or the resulting policies lose their legitimacy. Dissent forces accountability.
But for this deliberation to actually be well-ordered, it can't just be a chaotic shouting match on social media. There have to be rules to the game.
Peter outlines the rules for this deliberation carefully. She argues it requires participation. Norms, meaning who gets to speak.
Well,
The answer must be everyone. You cannot exclude voices.
okay.
It requires practical reasoning norms. Your arguments have to follow basic logic. But crucially, and this is where her theory really shows its teeth, it requires epistemic norms.
Epistemic norms. Rules governing truth and knowledge in public debate. Now, I am going to push back here again. If we have established that arbitrary, fact-free decisions like ignoring the knotweed lead to ruin, why shouldn't we demand that all political claims be absolutely true?
What do you mean?
Why isn't there a strict truth norm governing our parliaments and town halls? Imagine if it were illegal or procedurally invalid to introduce a falsehood into a political debate. It would solve the misinformation crisis overnight.
It is an incredibly tempting thought, especially in an era drowning in manufactured realities and deepfakes. But Peter explicitly and forcefully rejects both the truth norm and the slightly lesser knowledge norm as being wildly, dangerously too demanding for a functioning society.
How can truth possibly be too demanding?
Because if we demanded absolute verified truth before anyone was allowed to speak, we would completely paralyze the process of discovery. Think about how the hard sciences operate. Even the most robust scientific models, climate change forecasts, epidemiological models, economic projections are not absolute eternal truths. They are the best available approximations based on current evolving data.
Ah, I see. If a politician introduces a carbon tax policy based on a 20-year climate model, they aren't asserting an absolute universally proven truth about the exact temperature in 2045. They are asserting a highly probable, well-researched forecast.
Exactly. If we enforced a strict truth norm, that politician would be silenced. Because the future is never perfectly knowable. We could never debate preemptive policies. We could only debate things that have already happened. It would freeze the government in place.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. If we can't debate anything unless we are 100% mathematically certain it is a fact, we can never innovate or plan for risks. So if the bar isn't absolute truth, what is her preferred standard for a valid political claim?
Peter argues for what she calls the justified belief norm.
The justified belief norm. So you don't have to be objectively perfectly right, but you must have a warranted, justifiable reason for what you are claiming. You can't just pull assertions out of thin air.
Correct. The burden of proof shifts to justification. If a representative stands up in Parliament and claims that funding universal health care will bankrupt the nation, they do not have to prove that with the absolute certainty of a mathematical theorem. But they must bring credible economic data, historical comparisons, and logical projections to support that belief.
And conversely, if their claim is based on a demonstrably false premise, say, a completely fabricated statistic they read on an anonymous fringe blog, or an AI-generated fake news story, then their contribution violates the epistemic norm. It is an invalid contribution to the public deliberation. It holds no weight.
And she pairs this justified belief norm with necessary procedural norms. One is responsiveness. You actually have to listen to the other side's justified beliefs and address their evidence. You can't just state your piece and put your fingers in your ears.
That seems to be the part we struggle with the most right now. We have competing justified beliefs, but no responsiveness. And she mentions another norm here that I found really compelling, epistemic justice.
Yes, drawing heavily on the work of philosopher Miranda Fricker. Epistemic justice demands that we evaluate someone's claim based on the actual evidence they present and not based on their identity. We must ruthlessly police our own identity prejudices.
Give me an example of how that fails in practice.
If a working-class mother from a marginalized community presents well-documented, highly justified claims about the toxic environmental hazards of a local factory, but the town council dismisses her evidence simply because she doesn't have a college degree or because of her race or class, they've committed an epistemic injustice. They have disordered the deliberation. The evidence was valid, but prejudice blinded the receivers.
So let's imagine a society where everything is working perfectly. We're deliberating fairly. Everyone is adhering to the justified belief norm. Epistemic justice is flourishing. But we still hit a wall. We have two massive factions of citizens. Both factions are using heavily justified beliefs. Both factions are looking at the exact same complex, fragmented data, but they arrive at completely opposite conclusions about what the government should do. Let's say it's an energy policy expand nuclear power versus commit entirely to renewables. Do we defer to someone or do we vote?
This is the critical juncture that Peter explores in the final sections of the book, focusing on deference, disagreement, and the ultimate defense of democracy. First, we have to look at political deference.
Okay, let's go back to the knotweed and the falling bridge.
Under Peter's framework, if well-ordered deliberation actually does manage to identify a clear, decisive cognitive authority, if the evidence miraculously aligns, the fragmentation clears, and the experts speak with one unified, empirically verified voice, then citizens and politicians are morally required to engage in political deference.
Moral deference. I have to tell you, that is a very bitter pill for a society that prides itself on rugged individualism and personal liberty. It feels like rolling over and giving up your autonomy to a technocrat in a lab coat.
It can feel that way, but Peter reframes it beautifully. She argues that deference in these highly specific, fact-based cases is not an abdication of your responsibility, it is the actual fulfillment of your epistemic accountability.
Because if the surveyor tells you the house is going to collapse, deferring to the surveyor isn't weakness, it's the only responsible, rational thing an accountable adult would do.
Precisely. If a severe public health crisis emerges, and the global scientific community unanimously agrees on a specific mitigation strategy, politicians have a moral obligation to defer to that expertise. For a politician to ignore that consensus and demand a public vote isn't an exercise in protecting political freedom, it is acting illegitimately. It is choosing the arbitrary will over the normative facts.
But as we keep coming back to, that perfect expert consensus is the exception, not the rule. The energy policy debate, nuclear versus renewables, is deeply epistemically underdetermined. There are brilliant physicists, economists, and environmentalists fiercely arguing on both sides with heavily justified beliefs. So what happens when well-ordered deliberation results in a genuine tie?
Peter defines this specific scenario as a normatively significant political disagreement.
A normatively significant political disagreement, meaning neither side is objectively wrong or lying based on the available fragmented evidence. Both sides have fulfilled the justified belief norm. It's a genuine, intractable tie of values and probabilities.
And it is right here, in the messy reality of a normatively significant disagreement, that Peter reveals her unique, deeply powerful defense of democracy. It's a concept she calls the negative epistemic argument for democracy.
Let's slow down and define that because it runs counter to how most of us defend democracy. Usually we hear positive arguments for democracy. We hear that the wisdom of the crowds magically processes information better than individuals and finds the truth, or that the aggregate of millions of votes somehow automatically calculates the objectively best policy.
Peter rejects those positive arguments entirely. The crowd is often not wise. It is often panicked, misinformed, and arbitrary. Her defense is negative. She argues that democracy does not magically find the truth. The outcome of a vote is not guaranteed to the right answer. Rather, democracy is a constrained secondary source of legitimacy that we rely on only when epistemic underdetermination forces us to fall back on mutual accountability.
I want to make sure I'm grasping the gravity of this. Because the experts are tied and because the evidence is too fragmented to dictate a single path, nobody can claim cognitive authority over anyone else. The scientists cannot act as the boss because the scientists disagree. Therefore, because nobody holds the truth, we revert back to our default state of equal political authoritativeness.
Yes, we use democracy, we campaign, we debate, and ultimately we vote via majority rule, not because it guarantees we will build the best energy grid, but because it is the only fair, morally justifiable way to adjudicate a tie between equally clueless citizens.
Democracy's legitimizing force is constrained. When cognitive authority is available, when the bridge is falling, democracy is bounded. It cannot vote against gravity. But when that cognitive authority runs out, democracy becomes the essential, irreplaceable bedrock of legitimacy. It is the only way we can move forward without resorting to violence.
And if we take a step back and connect this philosophical architecture to the bigger picture, the epilogue of Peter's book brings this theory crashing into our current cultural moment. There is endless hand-wringing in the media right now about post-truth politics, about fake news and alternative facts.
But Peter argues the real existential threat is slightly different, doesn't she?
Yes, she argues that the real danger tearing at the fabric of modern states isn't just post-truth, it's post-legitimization politics.
Post-legitimization, meaning we are collectively losing our grip on why a government decision is morally binding in the first place.
Exactly. Think about how dangerous it is when citizens no longer understand the hybrid nature of legitimacy. If people believe democracy just means my side won the election, therefore we possess the arbitrary will to do whatever we want regardless of empirical reality, that is a post-legitimization mindset. It inevitably leads to authoritarianism on one side or anarchic chaos on the other because it refuses to be bounded by facts.
And conversely, if people believe that pure expertise should rule everything, they become technocratic tyrants, dismissing the valid values and lived experiences of the voting public.
Which is why understanding this framework is so vital. If we don't understand when democratic decisions are legitimate and when they are strictly bounded by facts and epistemic accountability, the entire system loses its anchor. It just becomes a naked power struggle.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do you use this incredibly dense philosophical framework in your daily life? I think it empowers you to evaluate your own government and your own political demands in a profoundly new way. It gives you the intellectual permission to demand strict expertise and complete deference to science when physical lives are on the line and the facts are demonstrably clear. You can demand the government listen to the engineer about the bridge, but it also gives you the rigorous philosophical grounding to demand democratic inclusion, loud public debate, and fair voting when values are up for debate, when the future is murky, and when the experts are guessing just as much as you are. It tells you exactly when the expert should be the boss and when the people must be the boss.
It really is a remarkable synthesis of two very different, historically opposed ways of viewing the political world. It bridges the gap between the technocrat and the populist.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together for a comprehensive summary of our journey today. We started this deep dive exploring the limits of the political will. We examined the equal political authoritativeness of citizens, but we saw the devastating arbitrariness objection, the danger that pure, unchecked democracy can vote for demonstrably harmful, fact-ignoring disasters, like ignoring the toxic reality of the Flint water crisis.
Then we swung the pendulum to the opposite extreme and looked at pure factualism, the idea that government should just execute the objectively right decisions. But we saw that fail due to the accessibility objection. If the perfect political truth is too mathematically or sociologically complex for the citizens to understand, it cannot settle a public debate or bind a population.
Which naturally brought us to cognitive authority, or epistocracy rule, by the experts who do understand the complex facts. We learned about the expert boss fallacy, but we also learned about the Japanese knotweed and the crucial concept of epistemic accountability. If the town engineer proves the bridge will fall, deference is mandatory.
Yet we saw that this expert authority is severely constrained by epistemic underdetermination. In the chaotic, multivariable real world, evidence is heavily fragmented, and experts frequently disagree or simply lack the competence to solve massive social equations.
And so, ultimately, we landed on Fabian Peters' epistemic accountability conception, this brilliant hybrid model. It dictates that expertise and cognitive authority have lexicographic priority. They absolutely trump the political will when clear, decisive life-or-death facts are available. You cannot vote to ignore gravity.
But For the vast, murky middle ground of political life where certainty fails us, which is almost all of politics, democracy acts as the indispensable fallback. The political will kicks in conditionally, and all of this must be navigated through well-ordered deliberation, relying strictly on the justified belief norm and epistemic justice to prevent the system from being overwhelmed by bad faith arguments and dangerous falsehoods.
It is an incredibly compelling, realistic roadmap for navigating a very complex political reality. It demands that we be smarter, better citizens.
It demands an exhaustion of effort, yes. We have to constantly weigh the evidence while remaining humble about our own ignorance.
It really does. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. It's an extrapolation that builds heavily on everything we've just discussed from Fabian Peter's text, specifically pushing the boundaries of human limitation.
The limits of human cognition seem to be the fragile linchpin of the whole system.
Exactly. We spent a lot of time dissecting epistemic underdetermination. We established, using the COVID-19 example, that democracy is necessary, specifically because the human brain simply cannot process all the fragmented, contradictory evidence of modern politics. We do not have the bandwidth to synthesize global economics, viral epidemiology, and childhood sociology all at once to find the one true path.
We fall back on voting because our brains are too small to hold all the facts.
Right. But what happens to the fundamental legitimacy of democracy when artificial intelligence crosses a specific threshold? What happens when an AI becomes capable of synthesizing that wildly fragmented evidence flawlessly? If, a decade from now, a hyper-advanced AI system could theoretically process all the global economic data, all the virology, all the sociological models in real-time, meeting both the competence and body of evidence conditions to become a true, infallible cognitive political authority.
That is a staggering implication, because if the AI cures the epistemic underdetermination,
Yes. If the AI actually possesses the absolute truth about the most complex policies, would Fabian Peters' framework morally obligate us to defer our political will to a machine? If the AI is the ultimate expert, does it become the ultimate boss? Because we said earlier, when the traffic light turns red, you stop because you trust the system that programmed it. But if an intelligence far greater than ours starts programming the political traffic lights of our entire society, calculating the exact tax rates and healthcare mandates necessary for optimal human flourishing, will we still demand the right to hold a democratic vote on whether we should hit the brakes?
it forces us to ask if we love democracy because it makes us free, or if we only use democracy because we aren't smart enough to know the right answer.
Think about that next time you're sitting at a red light. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.